Thank you so much for staying with us. Let's get to meet our guest analysts. Two of them are right here in the studio, and one other is joining us virtually via Zoom. First, from my immediate left is Hands-Free Ajanaku. Mr. Ajanaku is the Programs and Communications Manager, Resource Center for Human Rights and Civic Education. Thank you so much for joining us.
I'm a privilege to be here.
Also joining us is a familiar face, Faith Nwadishi, is the Executive Director, Center for Transparency and Advocacy, and she is or has been very active in the area of the welfare of indigenous peoples. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me. Good afternoon, Nigerians.
And joining us via Zoom is a youth from the Federal Capital Territory, Abuja, Jacob Sananu. Jacob Sananu is, of course, a member of the indigenous peoples of the Federal Capital Territory. Right, he will be joining us in a short while. Thank you so much for finding time to join us.
Thank you.
First, let's go on an exploratory note. Who are the indigenous peoples of the world? Why are they so referred?
Thank you so much. I think your introduction actually captures very aptly the United Nations definition of who the indigenous people are. But in a nutshell, indigenous people are people who can lay claim to the originality of a place. That's because they have a distinct language. Before development, they were the ones who were in a particular place. And in Nigeria, there are some indigenous groups you can refer to. Those people who can trace their history to where they are presently residing, or people who they have taken away from where they are residing because of development. For instance, if you want to look at a very typical picture of a definition of who the indigenous people are in Nigeria, we'll take the Abuja original inhabitants, and you will take the Oyo Empire as it is. You know, they have been there, they have lived there, they have spoken the same language, they have a distinct culture, and we have some small indigenous groups across Nigeria. And you know that one thing that defines the fact that you're an indigenous group in a particular place is if you can talk about your history, your language, your culture to a particular place over a very long period of time. Not that you have migrated to that place, but you can actually trace your history to that particular place. It gives you the rights of indigenship of that place where you are, different from the individual that has come to meet you where you are and intermingled your culture. For instance, let me tell you a particular culture of the original inhabitants of the FCT. There's this cultural dressing that they have that they call bache. That's bache culture. You can find that it is indigenous to the people of the FCT. Every other person that has come into the FCT came with their own culture, their own distinct way, but it does not take away the fact that the original culture of the people of the place where you have come to meet them and they have dealt in that place, that's what gives you that definition and falls within the United Nations definition for an indigenous person.
Hands-Free, that definition appears to be a bit restrictive. For instance, there are many communities in Nigeria, many cultures in Nigeria that will claim indigenous status. The Yorubas, for instance, the Hausas, for instance, the Fulanis, the Urobos, and as many of them as possible, who, according to the definition put forward by Faith, would claim, could lay claim to being indigenous people because they have a long history of their settlement in those places. They have a history of their ownership of the territories and the languages that are indigenous to them. So why is it that the United Nations appear to restrict this definition to just a few?
Yes, so I think one fundamental point, and if you look at the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People and other extant instruments, that speak to the rights of indigenous people, there's a fundamental point, around the notion of identification, that indigenous people, have a right to identify as such. And so the UN has, always tried to move away from the idea of a definition, more to the idea of identification, because, that preserves the rights of the people. And one other dimension of it is how the indigenous people see themselves in relation to the dominant groups, in that particular space. And so they can assert that right, to their indigenous, status by saying, we are committed to the preservation of our culture, and our lives and our livelihoods are connected to certain key resources. For example, the land. For example, you talk about fishing communities. For example, you talk about the relationship between indigenous group and even natural resources. So some of those key components of the discussion are some of the unique identifiers that the UN has tried to use to differentiate, so that it doesn't become an all-comers affair. Everybody saying I'm indigenous where they are not. We know that there are indigenous groups in Nigeria, for example, who are not, in a sense, coming to the UN to say we are indigenous. That does not remove their rights, and their, the fact that they are indigenous to those places. But for those who have now stepped out, they are seeing an erosion of their culture. They are seeing the fact that livelihoods are being attacked. So that indigenous question is a way to also mobilize the global public opinion to say that attention should be focused on their issues against the background of the robust bouquet of rights that has been created under the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples.
In countries like Australia and New Zealand, they refer to certain groups of people as aborigines. Is there a distinction between aborigines and indigenous peoples?
Okay, so the nomenclature around the aborigine and the indigenous people is the fact that you have aborigines described as the original owners of a place. These people have been here, and depending on the different kind of cultures that you have had, people have had different definitions, and that's why you have, for instance, when we went to the UN recently and we are talking about the original inhabitants, they told us that the nomenclature has changed, that it is indigenous people. So you don't use nomenclatures like original inhabitants, aboriginals, so that there will be no confusion. So you have that wholesome definition, so that when you're talking about the indigenous rights of people, you know that the indigenous people are people who can lay claim to a certain place because of their culture, which is the same definition for aboriginals that you have. So as not to make that confusion about definitions and distinctions and how to determine their rights, you have that. For instance, if you go up to the Americas also, you have people, Canadians, you have people who say they are originals there, but right now the whole
you have people who also call themselves Native Americans.
Native, yes,
particularly
exactly,
in New Mexico and,
exactly.
And
so you have natives, either they call themselves natives, aboriginals, original inhabitants, but everybody is put under the description of indigenous person, because at the end of the day, when you look at the different definitions and the different nomenclature, you're actually talking about original people who have lived in a place, who have a distinct culture, who have a distinct rights. But because of most times the reason why all of these issues are coming up is because of development. And some of these people who are close to natural resources site are the ones who usually get displaced. And once the development is coming up, you see they are marginalized politically, they are marginalized economically, their original rights, the way they do things, they have this way, they preserve their rivers, they preserve their forests. By the time development comes, there is that they're taken away from them, they lose all of those. And this is directly linked to issue of history. So when aboriginals are talking about, we are the real people, the original people, or the natives of this place, they're also referring to themselves as indigenous persons, just to make it clear for everybody to understand that what we are talking about is the indigenous person. And like I said earlier, I learned also recently when we went to the 16th expert mechanism on the rights of indigenous persons, we're told that the description is not original inhabitants, but the indigenous persons, so that everybody will be on the same table when you are having those discussions.
Flowing from that, Hans-Free, you understand that in many parts of Latin America today, there are agitations by the so-called indigenous peoples for various rights. And these arises from what she said now, where development has caught up with them or met with them, or greater populations have come up to meet up with them in their natural habitat, and have that has overwhelmed them and taken over either their culture or even their language. Do we have such situations in Nigeria today?
Absolutely, absolutely. We have, very clear situations, like that in Nigeria. And, Faith has already let the cat out of the bag, mentioning the original inhabitants in the FCT. Let me just say a word on those, the nomenclature. Outside the UN context, there are some groups that actually want to identify in terms of being described as aboriginal. Some will say they are autochthonous. Some will also say they are, the First Nations, that have inhabited those places. So those nomenclatures are used interchangeably depending on the context and depending on the struggle, because the struggle also decides or determines what are the issues at stake that the original inhabitants, or the indigenous people are fighting for. In the context of Nigeria, we have the Ogoni people, for example, who, if you read the reports, various UN reports talking about the indigenous people, the Ogoni people feature very prominently, and that's why in the course of our own project of promoting the rights of original inhabitants in the FCT, we've tried to bring these indigenous groups across Nigeria to interact and also have conversations among themselves, learn from each other's struggles, and learn some of the techniques and the methods that have been successful, the best practices, the promising practices. Some of those things are, have been really very key in the course of the work we have done. So we are working directly with the FCT original inhabitant. In their own case, there are clear issues of political marginalization. There are, issues of economic exclusion, and also